There's something very familiar about all this. Now, before I actually get paid to speak, I think it falls to me to just say a few words. I've been speaking at conferences now for, it's not 50 years, Vitaly. It's not even 40, cheeky bastard. I've been speaking at conferences for 10 years, and I've been to a lot of places, I've met a lot of people, and I've worked with a lot of great conference organizers. And I have to say that there is not a single event that I have been to that isn't more friendly and welcoming and professional and inspiring as all of these Smashing conferences. So I hope you'll join with me in just thanking Vitaly and the Smashing crew for putting on such an amazing show. Come on, let's hear some more. All right, that's enough. So people have called me a lot of things since I started working on the web. I actually try to forget most of them. Jeffrey Zelman, without whom I think most of us wouldn't be here, he once called me a triple-talented bastard, which if you know how much I admire Jeffrey, you know how much that meant. And I work as an art director and a designer in a small little creative studio called Stuff and Nonsense, and we spend our time designing for clients and for screens. In fact, as Brendan Dawes once said about himself, we make fillings for rectangles, is what we do. And I've been designing for the web for most of my work in life, so it feels like I know the medium pretty well. And I've seen it change in ways that go far beyond what we see on screen, beyond the emergence of those web standards technologies that Jeffrey championed, beyond the rise of mobile and the challenges that we face with responsive web design. And at the same time, I'm seeing this industry mature into something which is very different from the almost joyfully naive creative playground that it was when I started. Because it's now a place where designers rub shoulders with developers and researchers and scientists and user experience professionals. Now, much of what has changed has been for the better, and this growing maturity and the way in which we approach our work has led in many ways to a better web. And we've made a web which is more accessible and flexible to users' needs as well as to devices of all kinds. But as proud as I am with everything that we've achieved, I do look at today's web with a sense of growing dissatisfaction, because for everything that we've gained, there's something that we're losing. Because while we focus our thoughts onto processes and methods and mechanics, instead of ideas, we're losing the creative soul in our work. And that's a soul that embodies individuality and personality, originality. It has an opinion. And it's a soul that connects people with those ideas, and it makes the ideas memorable. And that makes what we do matter. And I fear that our designs are lacking energy and spontaneity because we're thinking too early and too often about the consequences of failure. And we're creating a web that's so full of safe designs because we're driven by the need in some of us for predictability, for reliability or repeatability. And we're creating a web that design rarely dares to stray beyond the boundaries of these established conventions. You know, this modern web that we're designing for, it's responsive, and that is a creative challenge that we should relish. It's an incredible opportunity to be creative, but so many of our designs are just following the same responsive formulas. But, you know, I am optimistic. I hope that this soulless period is going to pass like so many phases have before. And I'm hopeful that we're still going to be capable of making work that, as Johnny Ive said about Steve Jobs, can suck the air from a room. Now, giving our work soul and making space and time for creativity and for experimentation and above all for ideas. That's the subject of this talk. And I've stolen its title from a quote from Don Draper's Mad Men. It's from an episode called The Monolith in season 7. And it's set in 1968. And Don was told that the IBM 360 computer can count more stars in a day than we can in a lifetime. And he replied, "But what man laid on his back counting stars and thought about a number?" Now, the advertising world that Don inhabits is going to be the background to this talk, because I still believe that advertising is one place where we can look for the soul that we're missing. And it's also where we can learn as much about clear and concise communication and reduction and simplification as we can in what many people now call user experience. Now, I find advertising absolutely fascinating, but I know that not everybody shares my enthusiasm. And as somebody who studied fine arts, I believe that the job of solving our biggest problems should be for artists, as well as for designers or for engineers. And I'm a sucker for an artist's quote. But Banksy, he doesn't share my fondness for advertising. He wrote, "People are taking the piss out of you every day. They butt into your life, take a cheap shot at you, and then disappear. They leer at you from tall buildings and make you feel small. They make flippant comments from buses that imply that you're not sexy enough and that all the fun is happening somewhere else. They are on TV making your girlfriend feel inadequate. They have access to the most sophisticated technology the world has ever seen, and they bully you with it. They are the advertisers, and they're laughing at you." Now, there's a common perception, particularly amongst most of us that install ad blockers, that advertising is an industry that routinely interrupts us when we least want interrupting. And it regularly attempts to sell us products that we neither need nor want, and it lies to us while it's selling. The writer and the humorist Stephen Leacock once wrote, "Advertising may be described as the science of arresting the human intelligence long enough to get money from it." Love that quote. And for some, advertising's become a dirty word. So how can advertising, which is an industry that some might argue is outdated and irrelevant, how can it teach us anything about the very different industry that we all work in today? You know, in his book, Purple Cow, Seth Godin wants us to stop advertising and start innovating. Because, as consumers, we're too busy to pay attention to advertising. And yet, he acknowledges that it's probably impossible to read through a list of successful brands without either picturing one of their commercials, remembering a tagline, or hearing a jingle ringing in our ears. Advertising has given us some of the most memorable creative work in decades, and it's the mark of great advertising that it stays with us long after a campaign is over. So, I guess that every generation and perhaps every country or culture remembers particular advertising. So, as an Englishman, it's DDB's chimpanzee campaign for PG Tips tea in the UK. This is the campaign, it's the tea you can really taste. And this campaign began way back in 1956 with a black and white TV commercial and a voiceover by none other than Peter Sellers. And these chimpanzees, they were often voiced by famous actors and comedians. They parodied popular culture and politics and sport and television for the next 3 decades. And in 1971, in fact, it was November 1971. Is that honestly anybody apart from me in the room that can remember November 1971? Oh, there is a few unfortunate souls. In 1971, Avez-vous un cuppa and Cooey, Mr. Shifter, they became catchphrases that were as memorable as the campaign's taglines. There's no other tea to beat PG, and it's the tea you can really taste. Here's an ad.
Get in the hang of it. Mind the banisters, son.
Oh, I can't hold it, Dad.
Don't worry, son. I shifted more cannons than you've had hot dinners.
Cream, Mr. Shifter. Like refreshment.
Oh, thank you most kindly, madam. One way of shifting it.
When a good cup of tea really counts, you're right to drink Brook Bond PG Tips. It's the tea you can really taste.
Dad, do you know the piano's on my foot?
You hum it, son. I'll play it.
I love that ad. I could watch that ad all day. I sometimes do watch that ad all day. If you've seen my website recently, you'll see our PG-inspired new header based on that commercial. Now, in the first 2 years of the chimpanzee commercials, and off the back of its advertising, PG went from number 4 position to number 1, and they maintained that top spot for the next 32 years. Largely due to their creative advertising. And the campaign was more than just clever copywriting and well-trained chimpanzees. It succeeded because the combination of advertising and entertainment made the pleasure of watching those commercials synonymous with drinking PG Tips tea. Now, I could probably write a book about PG Tips and their chimpanzee advertising. I might do that one day. Oh, but my wife's in the background going, please, God, no, you're never going to write another book. She threatened to hunt down and kill anybody that asked me to write the last book. Vitaly's still alive by some miracle. I could also talk about Leonard Rossiter and Joan Collins' campaign for Cinzano. And don't get me started on Cadbury's Smash instant mashed potato, or 1970s Texan bars, which were a toffee chocolate bar, and the commercials featured a cartoon cowboy and possibly the best, worst cowboy tagline, "A man's gotta chew what a man's gotta chew." Do you remember those, Bruce? They sure were a mighty chew. Now, today's equivalent might be Wyden and Kennedy's campaign for Old Spice's "The Man Your Man Can Smell Like." This was a series of commercials that cleverly targeted a male body wash product at female buyers who imagined their man smelling like the man in the commercials.
Hello, ladies. Look at your man. Now back to me. Now back at your man. Now back to me. Sadly, he isn't me. But if he stopped using lady-scented body wash and switched to Old Spice, he could smell like he's me. Look down. Back up. Where are you? You're on a boat with the man your man could smell like. What's in your hand? Back at me. I have it. It's an oyster with 2 tickets to that thing you love. Look again. The tickets are now diamonds. Anything is possible when your man smells like Old Spice and not a lady. I'm on a horse.
That was done in one single take, and the only bit of CGI is when the bottle of Old Spice comes out of Isaiah Mustafa's hand, which is amazing. There are videos online that show you how that was done. Fantastic. So some people confuse advertising with misleading people about a product. But successful and effective advertising, through a process of reduction, removing messages that might cloud aspects of communication, it aims to communicate and emphasize a truth about a product or a service or a brand. DDB's famous campaign for the Volkswagen Beetle, which was a campaign that started the modern advertising industry, it wasn't just memorable for clever copywriting or for distinctive art direction, but because it told the truth about Volkswagen's products. And I know that's a strange concept these days. Any Volkswagen drivers or Germans in the room? Now, the VW Beetle was noisy and it was small, but it was well built and it was reliable, and that was the truth back then. And DDB's advertising didn't hide it, and customers responded to that and the messages that the advertising conveyed. The Beetle was a smart choice, and people felt inspired to feeling smart about choosing one. So in many ways, the ad said, this car is individual and smart like you. And successful advertising always evokes an emotional response in us as consumers. And as Don Draper said in the first ever episode of Mad Men, advertising is based on one thing: happiness. And do you know what happiness is? Happiness is the smell of a new car. It's freedom from fear. It's a billboard on the side of the road that screams reassurance that whatever you're doing is okay, that you are okay. Now, Old Spice is the man your man can smell like. Those commercials don't say anything about the product itself apart from the fact that it doesn't smell lady-scented. They also knowingly play on the fact that the advertisers and the audience know that the product won't turn men, unfortunately, into Isaiah Mustafa. And I'd also argue that Old Spice told the truth about what it thinks many women consumers were thinking. They wanted their man to smell and look like Isaiah. And Leonard Rossiter and Joan Collins and the Cinzano advertisers back in the day told the truth too. Just like their characters, Cinzano was pretending to belong to a higher social class. And for 30 years, PG Tips owned the truth about tea. Drinking a cup of PG Tips makes people happy. That was the message. And all of these campaigns conveyed messages about the product that they advertised, and they did it with charm and personality and with wit that is so vital in making creative work memorable. And while we can all probably point to a memorable commercial or poster campaign or a magazine ad, can you honestly point to as memorable a website from recent times? You know, I can think of many sites that are well presented and easy to use. We might think of them as being a triumph of user experience. They could be built technically competently, but few that are going to be remembered for years to come. Why? Why is this? Why are so few websites memorable? Why are so few bearing their souls? What are the reasons? Could the design processes that we've come to rely on, particularly in relation to responsive web design, can they be hindering creativity? You know, our modern web design magazines are full of articles and advice about process and techniques and tools, but very little about creativity or about humanity or about ideas. Can our emphasis on human-to-computer interaction mean that we're forgetting the importance of human-to-human communication? And does our reliance on research and testing mean that we're simply delegating design decisions and abdicating responsibility for those designs? And could our current preoccupation with user experience methodologies mean that just we're less willing to take risks? Have we become so fixated with designing digital products that we've forgotten that the web is a medium for communication outside of applications? You know, much of what I read today amplifies the voices of data-driven design over ideas. And I believe that all of these factors have combined to create an environment that produces work that, while it's aesthetically pleasing and well considered and technically accomplished, it somehow lacks the emotional appeal that's as important as those functional abilities. In April 2014, a List Apart magazine published a letter to a junior designer by product designer Kenneth Bowles. And in it, he made a case for young and new designers to slow down, think things through, and to temper their passions. Slow down, he said. You pluck an idea from the branch and you throw it onto the plate before it's had time to ripen. And he went on. Perhaps your teachers exalted the idea as the gem of creative work, taught you that the idea is the hard part. I disagree. Ideas aren't to be trusted. They need to be wrung dry, ripped apart. So, as you might imagine, when I read Kenneth's words and I thought about the junior designers that he was writing to, I just imagined designers it might be in some dystopian future where there's so little time for an idea to blossom before it gets crushed under the boot of user experience. And when Kenneth wrote, "In time, the distinction between idea and iteration will blur, and eventually the two will become one," I just heard the words of George Orwell. Power is in tearing human minds to pieces and putting them together again in shapes of your own choosing. And like Winston Smith's character at the end of 1984, I just imagined the junior designers that Kenneth was writing to as disheartened and demoralized. So I bet you can guess, I just felt compelled to respond. And I wrote a different letter to a junior designer, one that I hoped would inspire rather than depress those same junior designers, because I wanted to tell them that there can be a future where their energy and their enthusiasm will make a difference. That they must never forget that it is ideas that matter the most, because without them, there'll be nothing. I wanted to tell them that you cannot ever turn a poor idea into a brilliant one by iterating. And that instead of having fewer ideas, we must have more. So don't slow down, as Kenneth suggested. Speed up was what I wrote. Your mind is a muscle, just like any other. You need to keep it in top condition. And to keep making ideas happen, make more of them more often. Feed your mind with inspiration wherever you can find it. Exercise it with play. Make idea after idea until making them becomes a reflex. Because, as we've seen this afternoon, the truth is we don't always need to think things through. It's not the right way. We can't ever predict the path that our ideas are going to take. And we can't know the limitations that are going to be put on them. So my advice isn't to try. Because too often I see brilliant ideas extinguished because people think about practicalities too early. They think, how's this thing going to be built? How are we going to make this responsive? How's somebody going to use it? And these are important questions, but at the right time. So naturally, some ideas are going to fade and other ones are going to dazzle. So before we pinch out the flickering flame of a new idea, we must let it burn brightly for a little while longer, unhindered by practicalities. Now, this tension between approaches to design is so starkly illustrated by our respective letters. It's not a new phenomenon. Towards the end of the 1960s, technology had become creeping into advertising, and in '68, Mad Men, Sterling, Cooper, and Partners Agency, they installed their first computer, which is the room-filling, low-humming IBM 360 that I mentioned earlier. Of course, this thing being Mad Men, nothing's ever as straightforward as installing a computer. Because practically, entering the future meant installing that computer on the site of the agency's creative lounge, which was a space where art directors and copywriters met to collaborate. So without a central space to share, the creatives were forced back into their separate offices, afraid that the computer was going to replace them. And Don Draper's only half joking when he asks the engineer who's installing the computer, who's winning? Who's replacing more humans? Now, new partner, Jim Cutler, his vision for SC&P is in stark contrast to Don's. And in the final episode of that season, Jim says, I know what this company should look like. Computer services. This agency is too dependent on creative personalities. We need to tell our clients we're thinking about the future, not creative hijinks. Creative hijinks. You know, it might first seem that Kenneth's data-led approach to design and my ideas-led approach are at opposite ends of the spectrum of design styles, but ideas are not at odds with user experience. They're a fundamental part of it. And the mixing of the two is a wonderful creative challenge. So there's common ground, and Kenneth wrote in a follow-up to these letters, we love to believe that design speaks for itself, but a large part of the job is helping others hear its voice. And I agree, because when our work has a voice, it means it stands for something. Now, Sir John Hegarty, he's co-founder of advertising agency Bartle Bogle Hegarty, BBH. And he wrote in his book, it's essential for a creative company to have a point of view, a philosophical foundation for their work. And a point of view is an essential part of design, because like the best art, the best design must stand for something. So we've got to ask ourselves, what does my work or my company stand for? What are our principles? And we've got to stand behind our work because we believe in it, not because that point of view has evolved through iteration or been validated by testing or driven by research. You know, I think I'm probably proving advertising legend David Ogilvy wrong when he wrote, creative people are stubbornly allergic to research. But I do worry, though. I worry that as an industry, we've become so heavily focused on conversations about research-driven, data-led design and then subsequent implementation issues, including responsiveness and including performance. And we should temper that use of data with hunches and vice versa, because as Kenneth wrote, product design that's driven entirely by data is horrible. It's soul-destroying for a designer. So, I'd like you to cast your mind back to some advertising ideas that have stayed with you. If you're a British beer drinker, at least there's two of us, you might remember BBH's The Cream of Manchester campaign for Boddington's Brewery in the 90s. Anybody remember this ad? A few lonely Boddington's drinkers still around. In 97, Boddington's sales peaked, largely attributed to their clever advertising. If you've got more exotic tastes, you might recall Saatchi & Saatchi's campaign for Castlemaine 4X. This 4X brand was actually introduced way back in 1924. Did you know that the X's refer to the strength of the beer? And Saatchi's made a household name in the 1980s with a campaign that featured the tagline, Australians wouldn't give a 4X for anything else. Foster's Lager is actually owned by a South African brewing company, and the brand is licensed in Europe to a Dutch company, Heineken International. Still, Foster's is stereotypically the amber nectar in the UK, and it's Australian for beer pretty much everywhere else, except Australia, where they actually sell very little beer to thirsty Australians. Now, you can probably guess, I'm more of a tea drinker, and you can guess that I drink PG Tips. And the Tips was added to the brand name way back in 1955 to emphasize that PG only used the freshest parts of the tea plant. And it wasn't until 1956 that Peter Sellers provided the voice for that first chimpanzee commercial. Where do you think the idea for that first commercial came from? Did it come from asking a focus group? Did Brooke Bond conduct some consumer research? No. The idea for a campaign that lasted 3 decades came when a copywriter, Davidson, Pierce, Berry and Spotswood, that was the agency at the time, they were stuck for an idea for a new commercial, went for a walk around Regent's Park, which is now London Zoo, where he saw chimpanzees dressed in human clothes having a tea party to entertain visitors. Now, I bet that if you'd have asked a group of 1950s tea drinkers to personify tea, they'd probably have suggested a beautiful Indian woman picking the tips before they'd told you about Ada, the chimpanzee tea lady. So no market research, no listening to consumers, no work on personas would stimulate the idea of the magnitude of the PG Tips chimps. Now, the web has meant that anyone with an idea can communicate it. We don't have to spend big money on advertising in print and on TV. And what matters in the 1950s, in the early days of the advertising industry on television, matters today on the web. It's an idea, an amazing and brilliant and creative and entertaining and fantastic and gigantic, hilarious and inspiring idea. And it's an idea that can inspire and encourage and engage and make people think and change their perceptions. And it's an idea that demands attention not for its own self-gratification or cleverness, not for exploitation or for shock value, but for what it stands for. And as John Hegarty, who was the creative force behind the Cream of Manchester, wrote, ideas are the building block of creativity. Whenever you create, from writing to filmmaking to painting to composing, you start with an idea, and without one, you have nothing. So, while I imagine a website that's designed to sell my favorite tea, I just expect it to be well designed and technically proficient and easy to use. I expect to find what I'm looking for quickly and easily, and for the information to be well presented. And when I'm buying a packet of PG, I expect the process to be quick and the experience to be smooth. And the aspects of user experience and usability that focus on ensuring that a product or a service work well, they're important, but that's not enough. Because there's no magic in simply making something easy to use. Where do the chimpanzees fit into the process? And while some of us revel in creating that's chaotic and impulsive, maybe unpredictable, others amongst us create patterns and systems because they crave predictability. And we regularly hear the word process in relation to designing for the web. Recently, our conversations about responsive web design, they've been dominated by process. And one that's been spoken about regularly over the past few years has been this idea of designing at applications elements outside of the context of layout to make some form of style guide. And these are common patterns that might be used across a website or an application's design, and they might include components and form elements and modules and navigation, etc. And we refer to this as building a toolkit. And I gave this combination of typography and color and texture in the absence of layout. I called it atmosphere. And it describes the feelings that are evoked by color and texture and typography. And we might think of it in different ways. You might think of it as mood or feel or visual identity. And separating components from layout, it can help people to focus on their design without setting expectations about how those components are going to be arranged across responsive viewport sizes. But I worry a lot that we're becoming intoxicated by processes like this, and that we're losing sight of what we're ultimately making. You know, one system that's become synonymous with responsive web design is Brad Frost's atomic design, and he describes it as a methodology used to construct web design systems. And that methodology, it even has a tool, it's called Pattern Lab, and it's used to create atomic design systems. And Brad first wrote about atomic design a couple of years ago, and he said, lately I've become more interested in what our interfaces are comprised of and how we can construct design systems in a more methodical way. Now, Brad's inspiration for atomic design was chemistry's periodic table. And although I can't think of anything less creatively stimulating, I can imagine someone who's driven to make the creative process predictable, finding comfort in the atomic design process. But not everybody is convinced about abstracting design the atomic design way. Mark Bolton wrote about his concerns, and he said, conformity and efficiency have a price, and that price is design. That price is a feeling of humanity, of something that's being created from scratch. He went on, what I described is not a design process, it's manufacturing. It's a cupcake machine, churning out identical cakes with different icing. but they all taste the same. Sound like Squarespace to you? So I think that it's important to remember that creativity can never be, almost by definition, should never be as predictable as manufacturing. We can't and we shouldn't attempt to rationalize creativity by turning it into a process. Because it's often so chaotic and unpredictable. We go for a walk and we might get an idea. We take a shower, we might get another one. Ideas come when we least expect them. So we've got to enjoy ourselves and laugh, and above all, have fun with our work. David Ogilvy wrote in his book, "Make it fun to work at your agency. When people aren't having any fun, they seldom produce good advertising." So we've got to get away from the sketchbook and the notebook and the computer and get inspiration from the world around us. Look at the world we know from a different perspective every day. Take a different route to work. Take a bus instead of driving the car. Or, maybe just don't show up at all. Spend the day at the zoo watching chimpanzees. So I can imagine how some of you might be wondering, if creativity is so chaotic, how can it work inside a disciplined business framework? And we see people answering the same question by formalizing those processes into a workflow. And you've probably seen this if you've worked in creative services. As the former head of design at Google and Yahoo, Irene Au, defined, user research followed by interaction and product design, visual design, then prototyping and developing. Formative and summative research, qualitative and quantitative data and analysis, psychology, anthropology, and human-to-computer interaction, wireframes, prototypes, functional specifications, and flowcharts. Where is the space in her workflow for creating work that's any more than the adornment she describes when she wrote so dismissively, they, meaning us, visual designers, understand that visual adornment is meant to support the experience, not be the experience. Irene's responsible for material design at Google. And her assessment of creativity really shocks me. She wrote fairly recently about whether to hire a visual designer, and she said, "Hire a visual designer on a freelance basis who can create the look and feel of a design. Deliver a style guide and work with your front-end engineering team to build the visual assets, grid, typography, color palette, into a front-end library that then makes it easier for developers to create UI that's consistent." Is it any wonder why Irene and others have such a dismissive opinion of how designers work when we're all so busy promoting processes like atomic design? A process is a tried and tested method that we've used to do something that we've done before. But what is the point of following a formula? A formula will lead to a predictable but an ordinary result. And who wants to make something ordinary? Put your hand up. So I know that the answer lies somewhere on a curve between chaos and process, so that creativity isn't limited in any way by the parts of the process that we adopt. I'm sick of water. Can I get a Pepsi free? What did you say? If I want a Pepsi free, I have to pay for it? So David Ogilvy, I've mentioned him before. He was a strong advocate of a long written copy. Sometimes very long. He wrote ads that contain more words than you'll find in many of today's pocket guide style books about web design. And he wrote in his On Advertising book, "All my experience says that for many great products, long copy sells more than short." And he cited one successful ad for Merrill Lynch in the New York Times, and it ran to 6,450 words. And this runs counter to what many people would expect, particularly on websites. And he wrote, "Advertisements with long copy convey the impression that you have something important to say, whether people read the copy or not." I love that. And things changed in the late 1950s when DDB's widely cited Think Small and Lemon ads for VW America. They were written by, art directed by Helmut Krohn. Here is the body copy from Think Small. Let's see if you can count how many selling points there are. Think small. Our car isn't so much of a novelty anymore. A couple of dozen college kids don't try to squeeze inside it. The guy at the gas station doesn't ask where the gas goes. Nobody even stares at our shape. In fact, some people who drive our little flivver don't think 32 miles to the gallon is going great guns, or using 5 pints of oil instead of 5 quarts, or never needing antifreeze, or racking up 40,000 miles on a set of tires. That's because once you get used to some of our economies, you don't even think about them anymore, except when you squeeze into a small parking spot, or renew your small insurance, or pay a small repair bill, or trade in your old VW for a new one. Think it over. Isn't that brilliant copywriting? 136 words, 8 selling points, not including probably the most important fact that the VW is actually free of college kids. We've got a kid at college, I can tell you how important that is. In 1969, they ran this: "It's ugly, but it gets you there." And there were more classic taglines. "It makes your house look bigger." My favorite. "The only water a Volkswagen needs is the water to wash it with. And after we paint the car, we paint the paint." Nothing about emissions in the 1950s. Bill Bernbach, he's not only credited with changing the style of advertising for that work for VW, he's also credited with changing the way that copywriters and art directors work together on ads. Because before Bernbach, copywriters and art directors worked separately, as we've heard before. Copywriters wrote the copy for an ad and then they sent it to the art director who worked in another department to add the visuals. And Bernbach had a theory that if art directors and copywriters worked together in a creative team, they'd produce better advertising. And he was right, because out of these creative pairings, his agency produced some of the most iconic work of that period. And throughout the decades that followed, creative teams of art directors and copywriters, they remained at the center of the way we make advertising. But the roles changed, the copywriter's role changed. And imaginative headlines remained important, but that long copy became unfashionable. And copywriting focuses now on reduction, and writing a tagline means using as few words as possible. And today, I honestly think that copy matters more than it did at any time since Ogilvy's era, because we need copy now that's effective, from 140 characters in a tweet, through to a Facebook message, through to an email newsletter, or up to long-form body copy. So designers like me, we need to either write copy or we need to work really closely with a copywriter throughout the stages of a project. Because copy shouldn't ever be an afterthought. It shouldn't be something that we add to already made up page templates, because thinking about words can be a catalyst for new ideas, and it can help us develop better strategies. Designers have got to take more responsibility for copy, because for years we've complained about the quality of the content that clients have given us. But we shouldn't be surprised. A client might know a lot about their business and their products inside out, but that doesn't necessarily give them the skills to write. So communicating through written copy is as creative a task as creating color palettes or designing type or working with layout. And working with people to write copy helps us to develop deeper relationships with them. We get to know our clients and their businesses much better. So in my studio, writing copy is as much part of user experience as devising personas or developing prototypes. And an art director's role has changed too as new media and technologies emerge. So just as it did as the advertising industry moved from print to television, we've seen a similar change demanded by the web and everything that gets associated with that. But one of the biggest issues facing art direction on the web is just that so few people understand what it is and how it differs from design. You know, if you ask a web designer what they think when they hear the words art direction, many people will question the trend for those individually designed articles and blog entries for example, like Trent Walton, as we saw earlier. And there are overlaps between creative direction and art direction and design, so it shouldn't come as much of a surprise when people use those terms interchangeably. Designers can, and they sometimes do, art direct, and art directors can design, but the roles are different. Art directors provide the concept, and designers provide ideas and expertise to implement the concept. Dan Moore, he does a great job at explaining the difference between art direction and design, and he wrote, "Art direction is the visceral resonance of how a piece of work feels. In other words, what you feel in your gut when you look at a website or an app or any piece of design work." Whereas he explains good design as precision. Design is the technical execution of the connection. Do the colors match? Is the line length comfortable for long periods of reading? Is the photo in focus? Does the typographic hierarchy work? Is the composition balanced? We need the skills of a designer when we create the look, but the feel requires the skills of an art director who can ensure that those messages don't get lost through design. Phil Kaufman, he's an art director at a digital strategy agency called Springbox, and he said, "Design is about problem solving, whether you're a designer or an art director. The two roles differ in that the designer is more concerned with execution, while the art director is concerned with the strategy behind that execution." Problem is, on the web, we've become so fixated with problem solving and execution that our work has lost that creative soul that I mentioned at the start of the talk. The soul that embodies individuality and connects people with ideas and makes them memorable, and therefore what we do matter. Dan Moore explained, "Art direction brings clarity and definition to our work. It helps our work convey a specific message to a particular group of people. Art direction combines art and design to evoke a cultural and emotional reaction." Without art direction, we're left with dry, sterile experiences that are easily forgotten. And much of the work that I see on the web is exactly like Dan describes. It's dry and it's sterile. And I partly blame a lack of art direction for this lack of soul. But I also blame it on our fixation with the mechanics of user experience design. You know, Irene Au's list of UX skills includes only user research, interaction and product design, visual design, prototyper, web developer, front-end developer. Where is anything approaching the role of art director in her list of UX talent? So why is art direction on the web so rare? Jeffrey Zeldman, he himself comes from a New York advertising background, and back in 2003, Zeldman wrote, "On the web, art direction is rare, partly because much of the work is about guiding users rather than telegraphing concepts, but also because so few design schools teach art direction." And he went on. "Talented stylists continually enrich the world's visual vocabulary. The bad news is that we're decorating instead of communicating." So, stylists, decorating, visual adornment, just like Irene Au described 11 years later. So I think that art director and designer Stephen Hay, he can sum up the importance of art direction for us when he wrote, "Good design is pretty, but good design based on a solid concept will help make your sites much more effective and memorable, especially when compared to the competition." And many of the agencies that I deal with, they still favor the type of creative teams that were first established in the 1950s. But the web is significantly more complex to work in than print. So we have to have a variety of people with an even wider variety of skills on teams today. So there might be less of a requirement for a traditional copywriter and art director pairing, but there is a requirement for bringing people with diverse skills together. Maybe an art director, or a writer, or a developer, or a UX specialist, so that they can all collaborate in the ways that traditionally art directors and copywriters did. And if we want our work to be memorable, today we need them and other people to work together. But this is a real change. It's a significant change for a lot of agencies because they still structure their businesses along these departmental lines. So in a creative organization, we need people to be familiar with everybody's work so that they feel comfortable enough to share ideas and to maybe sometimes take risks. And proximity matters too, putting people with diverse skills together in one creative space and not be isolated into separate departments. So, to finish off, much of what has changed since I started working on the web, I think has been for the better. We have made a better web. But in other ways, I'm still dissatisfied because we're losing something. And that something is the soul, the creative soul of our work. But all's not lost. And we can make work that's memorable if we focus as much on creativity as we do on implementation. If we amplify conversations about ideas as much as we do those about process. If we create processes that promote creative ideas from the very beginning, and if we remember or rediscover the importance of art direction. And if we make spaces for people with diverse skills to work together in new style creative teams. If we can remember all of these things, if we can embrace creativity over predictability, we'll give our work back what it and the work deserves, and that's its creative soul. So thank you very much for listening.
So we don't have much time, but maybe you can join me for a couple of questions. Oh, this is nice.
Yeah.
Oh, I like that. Right. So, a few things really resonated with me a lot because when we start working on projects, we always start with text first. So it's kind of always jumping on text editor, trying to translate what we heard in the project into something like a copy or interface copy or dashboard copy, messaging, whatever, error messages and so on and so forth, to actually get to that core of the message we're trying to send. And then we actually do the entire visual part later. So this is kind of something interesting that we also keep doing. But people are wondering, so obviously approach like where you have a lot of art direction going on, when you have a lot of creativity and thinking and so on going on, it will require a lot of effort. It will require a lot of time. And many mid-sized companies just don't have the budget for it, or might not have a budget for it, for the time, for the execution, for real kind of authentic art direction. How can we convince them to do it, or how do we actually make it work on a big scale, not only for those exclusive projects that can afford it, but for most projects out there?
Budgets always get divided into a series of areas. There might be the creative area, there may be the technical area, there may be the CMS, for example. People choose to spend their money in many, many different ways. It could easily be the case, Espen was talking about this so eloquently earlier on, is that most people start by thinking about the complete package of what they need. Oh, we need a website, we need a CMS, we need this, we need that. Without actually thinking about what they're communicating to customers. So if it means that we have to spend more time on actually communicating and thinking about what that idea is, what is it that we're actually selling here? We're not selling a lawnmower, we're selling more free time that you can spend in a deck chair drinking margaritas, for example. If we can spend more time on that idea, maybe somewhere else in the budget has to give. And I joke about it, but something like a Squarespace site where we let somebody else take care of the code and the implementation and the CMS and all of that kind of thing, maybe that's absolutely okay. So I think there's always a balance. You know, people can't expect to get everything that they need, and a mid-sized company needs to really think about where their priorities are. And actually, is the best money spent on a fantastic idea that will connect people with their business, or is it best spent on a CMS that only 8 people will see?
Well, of course, yeah, but I mean, ideas are risky enterprises for many companies, right? They might work well, they might lead to tremendous results, but they might fail as well.
Yeah.
You might have invested, I don't know, 2-3 weeks of full day work, and then test it, and then it fails miserably. So that doesn't have to be a really good effort while building those systems, or kind of creating templates, or using CMS, or using WordPress theme. It's just easy, simple, and predictable, right?
It is easy and simple and predictable, and that's absolutely fine for the technical aspects of many jobs. What I don't think it's acceptable for in many cases is the creative concept and the way that we talk about Espen, as I say, I mentioned this so eloquently, is thinking about the content, thinking about the message that we're selling to somebody, and that's somewhere that we shouldn't compromise on.
Right.
You can have the flashiest website in the world, or the smoothest website in the world, and it can be built on Squarespace or any number of these competitive things, but it may not achieve your goals. It may not be the safe bet.
Right. Because usually when we talk about web projects or web design or any kind of project really, we talk about visual design. We talk about information architecture, we talk about UX, we talk about front end, we talk about performance, but copywriting is kind of a little bit in the back quite a lot of time.
Yeah.
So this is not necessarily something that people are concerned about first when they actually start working on a project. As we know, when Lorem Ipsum gets replaced at some point with something that gets sent along the way. So maybe just the role of copywriters in general should be reassessed and become more prominent in the process in general. Maybe it should come first instead of the framework selection and visual design and so on and so forth.
Copywriting's not just about writing long copy for the about page. It's about doing, again, I should have just paraphrased his entire talk, but when Espen was talking about the DNA of the company, it's that emphasis on words that can bring a new creative idea. So a lot of companies, particularly, web companies, when they talk about copywriting, they say, yeah, we have a copywriter that, will write your copy so that the description of the tractor that we're selling is, informative and everything else. But that's not the same as the copywriting that Espen and I were talking about. It's about coming up with that clear idea.
To communicate something clearly.
To why you should buy my tractor over somebody else's tractor. I don't own a tractor, by the way.
Oh, have another tweet.
I'd quite like to have a tractor.
Have another tweet which you won't like. Why should websites be remembered for years to come? Aren't we service providers?
Well,
Aren't we basically the idea probably being, so we are basically solving a problem for the client, selling something, right?
Well, if you think that we're just designing something, and design is problem solving, and design is product design or something like that, if you want to think about what you do in those terms, then fine. That's absolutely fine. I don't do that. I don't design digital products. I don't design power tools. What I do, I don't design power drills. What I'll do is I'll design the website that sells your power drill over your competitor's power drill. And the two things are different. And yes, they can be memorable, and we should be thinking about, putting things into our work that makes these things memorable. In the same way that we have, memorable albums, or music albums, or memorable movies, or memorable whatever it might be. These kind of things matter. And as creative people, we should be striving to make our mark on these things. I'm not the kind of designer that thinks that the work, that it's wrong for something to be identifiable. You hear a lot of designers that will talk about product design, and they'll go, okay, well, the best product design is when you can't see the fingerprints of the designer on the work. That's completely wrong. There should always be something about you and about your opinion and your beliefs in the work that you make.
Because otherwise you're just generic.
Because otherwise we might as well get robots to make it.
All right, that's a strong point at the end of the talk. Okay, excellent. Thank you so much, Andrew.
Pleasure, mate.
So good having you.